Chapter 26, Torpedoed. April 6, 1942. At about 2:20 a.m. in the darkest part of the night, with clouds covering the stars, the port lookout on the bridge of the long-range Nazi U-boat said, "Zavorn!" Target ahead, and read off the degrees. He'd seen diesel sparks in the blackness. Instantly, 4 high-powered binoculars were focused on the dim outlines of a ship. "She's not too big," said the watch officer, ordering speed decreased. Then he summoned the commanding officer from his bunk below. In a few minutes, the young Captain Lieutenant came up through the conning tower in his shorts and took a look, agreeing that the target was not as large as he would have liked, but his patrol had already been very successful. He'd killed 10 Allied ships, at least one a big tanker 7 hours ago. Low on fuel and food, he was headed home to the U-boat's base in Nazi-occupied Lorient, France, and had 2 greased torpedoes left in the bow tubes. Scanning the outlines of the ship, he decided to save one for the future and use one for this unexpected target. He sent the boat to battle condition, ringing bells rudely awakening those who were asleep below. Half-naked men ran to their stations throughout the slim hull. The first officer always fired the torpedoes when the U-boat was surfaced, as it was now, and he was on the bridge within 3 minutes, yawning and rubbing his eyes. The captain lieutenant said, "We take what we can get," almost apologizing for the size of the target. "Just use one. We can come in closer." The night would hide the submarine. Many of the Allied ships were still unarmed. The U-boat began to maneuver to get into proper firing position. At 2 o'clock, Timothy had been relieved of bridge duties to go astern and spend the rest of the watch on the Hato's fantail, on lookout. He'd steered for an hour, then stood bridge lookout for another hour. He went by the galley to fix a cup of hot coffee and take it out on the stern. Because of wartime conditions and the U-boat menace, the captain had ordered nighttime lookouts fore and aft. Timothy didn't mind the graveyard's watch from 12 to 4 because he didn't sleep all that much anyway. Old age again. He spent the time slowly pacing, watching the stars when the sky was clear, watching the flying fish spring out of the sea and glide away on the ship's passage. The little ship was blacked out and everyone aboard was asleep except those on watch. Timothy hadn't counted the passengers but thought there were 7 or 8 aboard. The Hato would discharge most of them in Panama. He'd heard several go on to Miami, the ship's next port of call. Timothy was glad to be back at sea, even if he wasn't on a sailing ship. The diesel engines in this one pounded, and the exhaust swooping down from her stack stank. But he felt the sea under his feet, and by moving forward a few feet, he could avoid the exhaust smell. It was good to be a sailor again. Though it had been 14 years since the Hetty Red rolled over and came apart in the wild seas between Antigua and Nevis, seldom a week had gone by that he hadn't thought of Jennifer Rankin and the other passengers who drowned out there. There had been a British board of inquiry at Antigua, the members concluding that Captain Timothy Gums had not been advised that a hurricane was approaching. No warning had been issued by the port authorities. Therefore, he was not responsible for the sinking of the Hetty Red. The hurricane was a weather condition over which Captain Gums had no control. But Timothy clearly knew he shouldn't have sailed that day. The glassy look of the sea, the heat, the smell of the air, the gathering clouds all told him he shouldn't sail. He gambled and lost. On nights such as this one, he thought of beautiful Jennifer Rankin, grieved for those who had died, and again asked to be forgiven. The U-boat's first officer shouted that the forward starboard torpedo tube was ready, bow cap off. It was wet and the torpedo needed only the impulse from the bridge to be unleashed. "Bridge control," said the first. The attack site, the target-bearing transmitter, was on, the Hato in the center of the crosswires, aimed just aft of the midship house. "Lined up," said the first. The captain lieutenant nodded. Everything was going well. He knew that within a few seconds the attack table would be connected with a gyro compass and the attack site. After that, it was almost automatic. So long as the cross wires of the attack site held the target, the apparatus would do its job. The torpedo was set at a running depth of 12 feet to tear out the target's bottom. Speed of 30 knots. Stand by for surface fire. Fire at 500 meters. The order was acknowledged from below. Tube 1 ready. The captain lieutenant said, Fire when ready. The first officer intoned, Ready. On. Finally he said, Fire! The firing button was pushed, the torpedo motor started, and 2 seconds later, the eel was on its way toward the Hato. The captain lieutenant looked at his stopwatch and counted aloud. An orange ball lit the dark sea, followed by a boom. Perfect, he said. Timothy was thrown to the deck by the explosion that drove the Hato sideways, and even before he could stagger up, the oil drums on the afterdeck were exploding, lighting the night with fire. A wall of it raged between where he was and the bridge. He heard yells and screams and the agony of shearing steel. He hesitated a moment, trying to think of how he could get around the wall of fire and help those people midships. He knew they'd try to launch a lifeboat, but the flames grew hotter and higher. Abandoned ship was all he could do. The starboard stern life raft, sitting on a wooden incline, poised to drop into the sea, had already been launched by the impact of the torpedo. In the red light that surrounded the ship, he saw it about 50 feet off the stern, and he climbed up on the after rail, diving down. Surfacing, he swam toward the raft. Chapter 27, The Quay. Our first stop, Isla de Providencia. 13 degrees, 21 north latitude, 81 degrees, 22 minutes longitude west. Together with Isla Santa Catalina, rose silently as we approached, shaped like a sweet potato about 10 miles long and 3 wide, taking in several cays, one of which was palm-covered. Low mountains were on both sides. Under a hot noon sun, we soon anchored in Catalina Harbor, where the water was so clear you could see crabs crawling on the white sand bottom. Bright-colored fish swam by. Nearby were half-dozen sea-worn turtle schooners. No one aboard them. Looking around, my father said, I don't believe this. We have to be at the edge of the world. I felt the same. We'd gone to a strange place that few people knew of, a place so remote that its owner, Colombia, cared little about its existence. Neither did any other nation. It was just a tiny blue shape on a nautical chart. 2 flashing lights marked it. Several hundred yards away on the beach was a streetless Isabel village, a collection of weather-beaten shacks that were turtle fishers lived. There was little sign of life as we paddled ashore in our rubber dinghy, but life did exist there, 30 or 40 grizzled fishermen. The brown and black men of Isabel cackled and shook their heads when my father said we wanted to go to the Devil's Mouth. Why go there? They asked. That's right, why go there? They said. Dom Quay is not worth the time and trouble. Take some pictures, my father said. The men cackled again. Take picture caves around here. Palm, Basalt, Low. Take Split Hill, Morgan Head, Alligator Point. That's right. It was not until my father said we'd pay for a guide that several became interested. Then coins were flipped. 2 days later, I stood on the bow of the Audaz Adventurero as it sailed northeast from Providencia. The weather hadn't changed, still sunny and warm. A few high white clouds were to the west over Nicaragua, just enough breeze to belly out the mainsail and jib. The sea was indigo, 5 or 6 shades darker than the sky's blue. A beautiful day in the tropics. War was not talked of or thought about. White-haired Eagletine Evermond, the turtle fisher we'd hired, stood with a tiller between his knees, silently looking out from beneath his battered straw hat. My father sat beside him. Captain Evermond was taking us to Boco Diablo, the Devil's Mouth. He didn't know why he was taking us. He didn't care. $50 and a bottle of rum were what brought him there. Of Caribbean sun had turned his wrinkled blackness into chocolate. He was a small man, missing most of his teeth. We guessed he was in his 60s, but his eyes were fish-hawk sharp. He said he'd been netting green turtles since he was big enough to climb into the cockboat. He was from Grand Cayman Island to the northeast. By mid-morning, I knew we were getting near the horseshoe of coral that harbored Timothy's Cay. I didn't know how I knew it. I just felt it, the way you'd feel the neighborhood in which you live. About 40 minutes later, Captain Evermont said, "Boca Diablo," and nodded ahead. We were coming in from the east, the same way the raft had drifted. Taking off my glasses, I put the binoculars to my eyes. Tops of palm trees clustered on the horizon. The island wasn't visible as yet. My heart began to thud as I counted the palms. If there were 15, it was my Cay, our Cay. I knew there were 15 because I climbed each one. I could only count 7 now, but I knew others were tucked in behind them. My father was standing. "Is that it?" "I think so." My heart drummed. The Audaz Adventuraro seemed to be creeping along, but slowly the island grew. First the palms, then the whiteness of sand below them, rising to what Timothy had said was the height of the island, about 20 feet. I put the binoculars down and wiped my eyes. The lenses were fogging up. My hands shook. I shouted back to them, "I'm sure that's it." When I looked through the binoculars again, I saw the hut to the right of the palms. "It is!" I shouted. "I see the hut!" Though I'd only touched it before, I was certain it was the one I'd rebuilt. My father joined me on the bow and took a look. "This cay's smaller than the one you described." Timothy had told me it was about 1 mile long and a half-mile wide. Now that I saw it, it was less than half a mile long and less than a quarter-mile wide. I suddenly realized he'd done that on purpose to make me feel better about being there. I wondered what other little lies he told me to push away fear. Now, I could see some low brush and sea grape. "'Tis a beautiful cay, this cay," Timothy had said. He was right. Soon we were within 100 yards, and the water was becoming shallow, coral heads visible beneath us. I only glanced at them, held by the sight ahead. Captain Evermont shouted, "Drop the anchor!" And it tossed, and I tossed the Danforth over the side as the mainsail came down. My father quickly lowered the jib, and within a few minutes the sloop rode at anchor. "Go," my father said, and I passed the binoculars to him, grasped my glasses in my right hand, and dove. Even the warm water tasted the same as I kicked toward the beach. Finally, my feet hit bottom. I remembered a little shelf and was glad I had tennis shoes on. Sea urchins lived on that shelf, and their sharp spines were painful. I waded in and took off my sneakers, digging my toes into the familiar warm, soft sand. I saw the remains of my fire pile. 9 months of wind had not entirely erased the charred wood. I walked along east beach, remembering. Then I went uphill to the palm trees in our crude but strong hut and Timothy's grave. I looked down. The coral stones and shells were still where I'd left them. I stood there for a little while, feeling very close to him. Shut my eyes, then said, "Dis be that outrageous cay, eh, Timothy?" On the wind that was rustling the palms, I thought I heard laughter, and a voice from above that said, "Dis be it, Philippe." I wasn't dreaming.